is the story of the Sylvester family in the 17th century, their origins in England as separatist Puritans, and their moving to Holland for religious freedom and economic opportunity. They were successful merchants, with Father Giles, originally the factor in Amsterdam, son Constant running sugar plantations in Barbados, and son Nathaniel running a provisioning plantation on Shelter Island, New York. Their story shows the unknown local role in 17th century globalization. The history of Long Island has been written by descendants of the English Puritan settlers. This excavation tells another story. It shows the multicultural and Dutch origins of the island. Alice Hench Fisk is the wife of Andrew Fisk, a 13th generation descendant of Nathaniel Sylvester and resident at the manor.
How the Sylvesters came to Shelter Island. Now that is an interesting project.
Dr. Steve Mrzowski, staff and students of the Anthropology Department, University of Massachusetts, Boston, excavated at Sylvester Manor for 8 years.
This is an ideal setting for landscape archaeology. And if you want to try to understand changes in the landscape and the way those changes reflect broader economic and political changes, and obviously reflect cultural values, you've got to see big areas. Once I saw the property, once I realized the history, and once I met Mrs. Fisk, I said, all right, I want to take this a step at a time. So we came down from UMass Boston, primarily digging small test units to see what we could find. What we found, of course, is that the 17th century plantation that was here is basically just inches below the surface of the ground. We came back with a much larger crew, a field school from UMass Boston, and excavated a much larger area. One of the beauties, of course, of having a property that's been in the same family for more than 350 years now is that development hasn't compromised the archaeological record. This is the first time that we've really looked at a northern plantation with an interdisciplinary team so that we can open up the fullness of this story.
In the 16th and 17th centuries, Philip II of Spain spent decades trying to Catholicize all of Europe, using gold and silver extracted from the Americas to fund his armies and navies.
The Dutch were involved in a long, drawn-out war with Spain, a war of independence, which went on for 80 years. It didn't end until the end of the 30 Years' War in 1648. During this period of time, the Dutch, who had been part of the Spanish Empire, or the Habsburg Empire, were cut loose after they revolted against Spain.
Once Holland actually gained their independence and actually founded the Republic of the United Seven Provinces, a whole new set of politics was established in Europe. And Holland became a major player on the world map. And at some point, the trading power, naval power, and all the well-established contacts within European context were so intense that actually, for a brief moment in time, Holland became a superpower.
1609 is a significant date. It's the date of the 12 years truce with the Spaniards. The Spaniards were being fought to a standstill by the Dutch on their own ground in the Netherlands.
Most occupying forces were then expelled. One of the tactics to actually make sure that the Spanish enemy couldn't move further into Dutch territory was actually damaging the dikes, which would let the seawater into the country, and that of course prohibited big forces to move into the Netherlands or to a particular city or town. One by one the cities were liberated and borders were basically drawn up, and the Spanish Empire ceased to have a large influence and a large hold over Holland, over the Netherlands.
In order to survive, they had to expand their own commercial interests around the world. Before they were Spanish and Portuguese trade network, now they were on their own. So they had to look for their own markets and their own sources of raw material. One of the major products the Dutch were producing at that time was herring. Herring was being fished by the Dutch in the North Sea for centuries, and the Dutch started the process of salting the fish at sea in order to preserve them. But what did they need was salt. and there wasn't salt in the Netherlands. So they needed to find places where they could get their own salt. And this led them all the way to Punta Raya along the coast of Venezuela. As early as 1606, they were sending ships down there. So they were looking for other means of protecting their commercial interests.
As a result of the frantic shipbuilding activities in the 17th century, most of the major oak forests in Holland were depleted. We could not sustain them anymore, and we had to start importing them from different countries, primarily from the countries in the Baltic.
They have to protect their interests in the Baltic, bringing in lumber and timber to produce ships, and also trading interests around the world in order to survive, to bring in grain from Poland and other products from around the world. They started sending ships to the Far East as early as 1598. They started taking over the Spice Islands from the Portuguese in what is now Indonesia.
To regulate this trade, in 1602, the Dutch East India Company was founded. They were formed out of several smaller companies which traded independently, and they joined, hence the name United East India Company. And of course the West East India Company did the same for a different region of the world to be able to trade over there, and they formed a big company, and specifically the VOC can claim to be the first real multinational empire in the world, almost like a modern company with agents all over the world, with employees all over the world, with offices all over the world. A lot of Dutch captains, sea captains actually worked for the Portuguese, learned about new techniques, learned about new trade routes, and slowly but surely Holland started to develop all this information into a strategy. They decided it was time to open up bigger trade routes, so a whole new shipbuilding industry was set up, and slowly but surely bigger and bigger ships were developed.
The Dutch appear to be the supreme capitalists. They could go into an area, they could analyze the market needs, they could go back to Holland and they could produce whatever it is that society wanted or needed. And they could do it in volume and for a relatively low price, undercutting everyone else. The underlying principle why the Dutch could do this, why they could build quicker and cheaper, had to do with their location in Northern Europe, and because of this machine that had been in Holland for centuries, the windmill. And suddenly you can run sawmills, and you can replace human labor with machine-driven labor, and you can standardize your cuts for your lumbers. You can work around the clock. What becomes clear about Dutch shipbuilding and expansion is that they were indeed the masters within this realm. They learned how to build ships quicker. They learned how to man them with fewer sailors. They learned how to move more product because their design could make the vessel very capacious. So all of these factors come together to produce a nation that can move a massive amount of product around the world for a very inexpensive price.
Orders came in not just from the East India Company, but also from abroad. The King of Denmark ordered Dutch ships. The King of France ordered Dutch ships. Holland was a hub of shipbuilding in the 17th century. France had a fleet of in total about 400 ships. Holland had a total fleet in excess of 10,000 ships.
They produced so much ships in the Netherlands, they couldn't find enough skilled carpenters to build these ships. So what they could get were foreign laborers from Germany, from anywhere in Europe.
The Dutch trade with everyone. They are the primary open traders in the early period in Brazil, in Spanish America, in English America, and so forth.
Success in this kind of world means that you know something not only about North America, but you know something about Europe, about Africa, about the West Indies, and you have commercial connections and what were called correspondents, that is, people that you could write to and count on them to dispose of a cargo at a fair price and give you your money when it was due.
The Dutch banking system becomes this worldwide commercial empire. They understand that a banking system that is efficient and trustworthy is an integral part of commerce.
One of the world's first stock exchanges was founded in Amsterdam, which is more or less still in use today.
The East India and West India companies are both stock companies. They sold stock. It wasn't just to the wealthy. Barmaids bought stock. When the East India Company went on the market in 1602, people from all walks of life invested in it.
People with funds, with money, to be able to invest into a particular journey of a ship and have a share of the profits. And it is known for some of the ships that returned to the Netherlands after a successful journey to the East Indies to make up to 700% profit. And many of the beautiful canal houses you still see in Amsterdam today were built with money earned from those trades.
Dutch merchants interested in the Atlantic had to build networks of commerce that could get them the tropical commodities they did need, networks they could then utilize to meet demand. So you find Dutch warehouses on many different islands.
New York merchants would send raw materials down to the West Indies, come back with sugar, and then they would send that sugar to England and come back with money, with commercial paper that they could use to pay for imports from England itself.
And the English definitely wanted to further develop the coastline of the Americas, which of course was already settled by English merchants, which left England, came to Holland, and then from Holland across the Atlantic towards America. Hence the cessation almost of the Dutch interest in America.
The Dutch and the English were both Protestant nations by that time, and there was a lot of interaction across the North Sea.
Many English people went there, often for economic reasons, religious reasons, because they were very tolerant. And among those, we find a couple who married in Amsterdam, and that was Giles Sylvester and his wife Mary Arnold.
This is the marriage register of Giles Sylvester and Marie Arnold of the 6th of July 1613, showing that at that time he was living at the Kalverstraat in Amsterdam.
Mary was the daughter of Nathaniel Arnold, a merchant of some wealth. The family originally came from Lowestoft, England.
We know where Giles came from Salisbury in Wiltshire, but we don't know more really about his family. We know a lot more about the Arnolds because they came from Lowestoft in Suffolk, and they came with some children, and then they had some more children in Amsterdam. And the family kept up very closely with their Arnold relatives and referred to them and had letters back and forth. The family connections and who you related to was very, very important. That's who you turned to for a job, and that's who you looked to and expected to get something.
Giles and Mary had 7 children. 2 of them, Nathaniel and Constant, formed the merchant enterprise with their father.
Nathaniel Sylvester, together with his father, Giles Sylvester, were already doing trade to Virginia in tobacco in the 1640s. By this time, the Sylvester family were already involved in the trade to the Americas, which is quite early actually. The Sylvesters, both Giles and Nathaniel doing in the 1640s, is trading English Virginia tobacco to Amsterdam in Dutch ships. By 1650 that becomes more difficult, and to continue a trade like that you would have to move to America.
What we see is a progress of the Sylvesters going from England to Amsterdam, living there, and then going to Barbados. Nathaniel and Constant are mentioned in Barbados records, and then Nathaniel came to Rhode Island and marries Griselle Brinley. And the Brinleys would say a gentry family, and indeed their father was a financial advisor to the king, one of several, probably, a fairly high-ranking civil servant. When their daughter Anne married William Coddington, who was then made governor of Rhode Island, that would naturally be a magnet for the Brinley relatives to kind of go in on his coattails and look for opportunities in New England.
Father Giles dies in 1651, which changes the family enterprise. Constant owns sugar plantations in Barbados and becomes partners with Thomas Middleton, Quaker Thomas Rouse, and Ensign John Booth to purchase 8,000-acre Shelter Island. Nathaniel is to run the provisioning plantation under the Articles of Agreement signed by the partners. Shelter Island was originally part of Virginia, an English concept that included all lands from Canada to Virginia and across America. Charles I of England granted this vast territory to the Earl of Stirling to develop. The Earl appointed James Farratt as his agent to sell parcels of land. Stephen Goodyear of the New Haven colony purchased Shelter Island from Farratt for speculation, but he did not pay the native Manhasset people of Shelter Island.
On Shelter Island, the Manhassets under Yuko and so forth had been part of the group. They were very eager to have the English come. They wanted access to trade, and they hoped that there'd be some military protection and so forth.
The four merchants purchased Shelter Island from Goodyear for 1,600 pounds of good Muscovado sugar. The Manhassets and Kakano, a Shinnecock who translated for the settlers and natives, to the New Haven colony court to protest losing their land to the arriving Europeans.
The protest was not so much that they didn't want Sylvester there, but they wanted to be paid.
In March 1652, the merchants purchased the island from the Manhassets. The amount paid is not known. The lives of the native people were changed forever.
One of the keys for landscape archaeology is that you really have to open up big areas.
We started doing a very close interval topographic map of the site to incorporate the use of GIS, Geographic Information Software, into allowing us to reconstruct the 17th and 18th and 19th and 20th century topography of the site. We just download that into our computerized system and use the GIS software to actually sort of relate the modern day topography to possible subterranean features.
This project at Sylvester Manor is very exploratory in this area. We're using geophysical methods, magnetometry, electrical resistivity, and ground penetrating radar to explore what might be here. Basically, there's a lot of unknown factors, a lot of gaps in the historical record. So we're mapping this field to see what might be beneath the ground.
This is the results of a survey that he conducted. This is the magnetic gradiometer survey, and this finds changes in magnetic polarity. Hard surfaces that might contain some kind of metal show up very nicely. Here are some obvious features of the modern landscape. There are concentrations of material that sort of have a shape to them, maybe a little square. That certainly looks intriguing. And this is an electronic resistance survey. This measures changes in the resistance of the soil to electricity. They do them at different depths. So this opening one here is at a depth of 25 centimeters below the surface. And this one here is 50. It really helps us to make decisions about where and how we're going to continue to move with the site.
We are seeing things in the archaeological record. What was somewhat surprising was the large amount of Dutch material culture. First, we found Dutch brick, very distinctive by their yellow color. We also found red pan tile, roofing tiles. Lots of the mortar that we're finding appears to be coral-based. All of that could have been brought in as ballast from Barbados. The Sylvesters owned 2 large sugar plantations on the island of Barbados. What they did was they relied upon provisioning plantations like this. Everything that was produced here was used to provision the plantations on the Caribbean. And the beauty of this plantation is we know the very plantations they were provisioning because they were owned by the same people. The Sylvester plantations in Barbados, which were run by the brother Constant and Nathaniel Sylvester, who ran this plantation with his wife Grizel.
Europeans first became interested in the Caribbean with the voyages of Columbus. His idea that he could go from the old world to Asia. Of course, he encountered the Caribbean.
You got on a ship and you sailed with the wonderful winds that brought you straight across the Caribbean, and the end point of that trip almost invariably was Barbados. It was very easy to reach Barbados.
The voyages were to produce a commodity, such as pepper and spices. What they began to realize early on, there were none of these spices.
Or a sweetener that you can only really get in ready supply from the Caribbean.
We're interested in how the Sylvesters became involved in sugar, but in order to know that, you have to go back to the history of sugar in Europe, and it didn't begin there. There was a time before the Middle Ages, when nobody dreamed such a thing as sugar ever existed. No sweet desserts after every meal, no candied snacks, just very little sweet food. We need to get back into the Middle Ages to understand the history of sugar in Europe. It originated in India and made its way with Arab traders into the Middle East, where the Crusaders found it. They found the Arabs who had brought sugar from India, growing it and cooking with it and doing all kinds of wonderful sweet things. And so people came home from the Middle East bringing sugar. Once in Europe, of course, it was embraced by all kinds of wealthy people because it could only have been very expensive. So royalty and aristocracy began proving their wealth and their power by putting sugar in their food.
Most people never tasted sugar. If you were just a regular Joe, you never got sugar. Sugar was much too expensive.
Sweetening was done with other products, with malted barley, with honey, with fruits as a source of sweetening.
We take sugar for granted today, but sugar was an expensive item, and it was highly prized by folks. On every colonial table, what they would have hoped would have had a little cone of sugar.
Sugar was introduced into Barbados in 1640, and it almost certainly came from Brazil. Dutch traders and Dutch merchants were very much in evidence around the Caribbean and South America at that time, and the Dutch had in fact discovered how to make the citizens of Brazil work very hard for them.
Many Jews are settling in the Netherlands. Remember, 1492 wasn't just the year Columbus left, but it was also the year that Spain expelled the Jews.
During the Inquisition, the Dutch in Holland were welcoming the Jews who left Spain and Portugal, and Recife was a part of Brazil that was as well Dutch, and therefore the Jews, many of them left and moved to Recife. These Jews had acquired the skill of sugar production and had also been involved in commerce. In the middle or early 17th century, the Portuguese took over Recife again, and these Jews who had spent roughly 200 years in Recife in Brazil, they were forced to leave and journeyed through the Caribbean, stopped in Barbados, and brought with them all that they had acquired in Recife. And what had they acquired? They acquired the art of sugar production, the knowledge of sugar, certainly the technology, because we have on record the name Demarcado, and Demarcado grave is attached to this building. This synagogue was built 350 years ago, and the Demarcado name is on record as having been the person that brought the art of refining sugar from Recife to Barbados. And he not only brought it to Barbados, but then was able to take that design and method and sell it to other Caribbean islands.
There are Sephardic Jewish residents, for instance, in Barbados, in Nevis, in Antigua, in the Dutch island of Curaçao, in New Netherland, which became New York City, as well as in Amsterdam. And these networks connect English, Dutch, and even French islands together, enabling more efficient trade, enabling the ability to find new markets and exploit those across national lines.
Sugarcane takes massive amounts of land to grow and produce profitably.
The rainforest was completely destroyed in order to make way for the plantation complex that developed on the island. There is the early 1635 map of Barbados, which shows Barbados pre-sugar. And then there's the 1770 map that shows every single square inch of Barbados being occupied by plantations. By 1717, as much as 700 functioning sugar plantations on the island.
By about 1650, 1660, there was a lot of wealth. Barbados was becoming known in Britain as, quote, the greatest jewel in the English crown.
Sugar produced an amazing amount of money. More money was made on sugar in the Caribbean than in all the North American colonies put together.
White gold, as it was called. There was money to be made out of sugar, and the sugar market was growing by leaps and bounds. Places like Barbados begin producing vast quantities of sugar.
The great advantage of Barbados for growing sugar was the fact that being a coral island with a shallow soil, it could grow sugar effectively and successfully. Sugar was simply a large grass, and it did not need a deep soil. The sugar plants were brought from Brazil, and in fact it was a very convenient type of crop for transplanting, for transporting from one country to another. But in Barbados they developed a system for planting the cane which was known as cane holes. The cane didn't like to grow in a waterlogged environment, so they pretty rapidly developed a technique of digging holes in a grid across the field and planting the cane at the corners of the holes. And this method of cane holing became famous, and people from a number of countries would come to Barbados in order to learn about the Barbados practice of cane holing.
The planter had to know when the field would be ripe, because the cane had to be cut at the exact moment when it was the ripest. It had to be carried from the field to the mill. The content of the sugar begins to sour after 48 hours, dry up. That meant that sugar plantations were really both farms and factories.
The grinding of the cane then took place initially with a cattle mill, the type of old-fashioned cattle mill where cows or oxen were yoked in place, and they turned the mill, which was a vertically mounted mill. But in turn, this was very rapidly in Barbados replaced by the Dutch-style windmill.
The technology that it used in the 16th century is basically the technology that it used all the way up to the middle of the 18th century.
And the sugar mill, if you look around Barbados, we have the old sugar walls, which are the circular-shaped, cone-shaped sugar mills, which are of Dutch design. And that again is another link to the Dutch influence and to the fact that these were the people that brought it here. And we had as many as 400 of these sugar mills dotted all over Barbados at the height of that method of producing sugar.
When the juice was ground, it was collected and would be taken or led by pipes or gutters to the boiling house. These would have been simple buildings with fires under the containers in large copper vats, which were known as plantages, where the syrup was being boiled.
The heat was raised, the impurities skimmed off, until at the final stage it was poured into a large mold that looked something like a large flower pot. It was then set in long rows of wood racks and allowed to sit for 6 weeks to a couple of months, at which time the sugar then crystallized in the mold and would be then taken out.
Now the product along the route varied immensely. The syrup became the very thick molasses and then eventually into the crystals of sugar. The dark sugar was known as muscovado sugar. Lighter sugar eventually became more attractive and more fashionable.
Now sometimes sugar planters said that they broke even on the sugar and they made their money on the rum, because rum is a derivative of sugar. Distilleries were operating in various places in the New World. Rum was a useful byproduct. You could give it to the workers as an incentive, or you could market the rum itself, either locally or in fact use it for international trade.
The name rum, which is universal today, certainly originated in Barbados, where it was first described as a hot fiery spirit, kill devil, or rum bullion. And the rum probably had a Dutch origin, or H-U-M, and the rum bullion suggested something very precious, a very precious product, and eventually the bullion part was dropped and the H was dropped, and so it became simply rum, R-U-M. So Barbadians feel that they have some responsibility, whether you think it's good or bad, for both the early popularization of rum and for the name of rum.
Because sugar was a difficult crop to grow, and there were many aspects to it, both agricultural and industrial, the techniques of sugar making were an art, and the people who knew how to do them were in high demand.
The product now of the molasses, the syrup, this of course was all exported. This was where the great wealth of the sugar planters came from. And even that led to the development of interesting industries, because the sugar had to be stored in some form, and it could be stored in barrels, and certainly the molasses and the syrup was stored in barrels, and these had to be very carefully prepared by a cooperage on the site of the factory and banded and corked and sealed so that they would not leak. These in turn were then transported to the warehouses in Bridgetown on the edge of Carlisle Bay, many of which survive today, and they were kept there until the ship came into port, which was going to take the sugar away.
When we mentioned the Caribbean being a hub, we also need to understand port cities such as
Port, which was going to take the sugar away.
When we mentioned the Caribbean being a hub, we also need to understand port cities such as Bridgetown. In the 17th century, Bridgetown went from a relatively insignificant wharf to a bustling port city.
By 1695, Bridgetown is the busiest English seaport in this hemisphere. It is rivaled only by Boston. It is a town roughly over 100 acres, densely populated. It is a town where the architecture, unbelievably, is Dutch. Most of the shops in Bridgetown at that time are as equally stocked as they would be in London. You're in fact looking at a transplanted European city of roughly the same age. You're looking at a town that had its own parliament created in 1639, which basically set the rules and laws for that island until independence in 1966.
Constance Sylvester was a member of the Barbados Parliament and was known as that Dutchman.
Merchants had waterfront properties, and very often in the second half of the 17th century built their own wharves or jetties where they could privately load or unload either goods that they were exporting from the island or goods that they were importing into the island. And many people had their private warehouses in Bridgetown where goods would be stored and then ultimately transferred inland to the inland plantations.
Barbados has between 7 and 10 plantation houses that date from the 17th century. The two very important houses of Jacobean style, high style, are Drax Hall, built by 1660, and around the same period, St. Nicholas Abbey. I do know that Constance Garden House was the plantation house for most of the early period of settlement. That's undoubtedly the house that Constance Sylvester would have been associated with. It's the house that was mentioned as the Constant Garden House in early maps as early as the first quarter of the 18th century. So that is the original plantation house, and you can see from the irregularity of the architectural features that it almost certainly is a very early house.
Mrs. Robinson? Hi, I'm Steve Mursowski.
Steve travels to Barbados to meet the current owner of Constant Plantation, Ms. Jean Robinson, who gives him a tour of the plantation.
Most of this is where the Constant land is, which is about 400 acres. That village is called Dash Valley. That is where most of the people who worked on Constant lived all their lives. And to this day, their descendants still live there. There is your cane.
Right.
That is your cane
Right.
here. Cut off this bit here that ends in just leaf. It'll
Okay.
cut it here, and then it'll cut it at the very bottom. And this middle bit is the cane that they grind and get syrup from and make sugar. And over here we have where the factory used to be. And this is just a teeny bit of the little old factory. You can see this is coral stone. See the honey-colored bricks?
Oh, yes. This is where they would burn up the cane to produce a syrup in the making of molasses. Can I take a piece of the brick?
Of course, pick it up.
Okay. I'll tell you why. We'll take this back
Of course.
and compare it.
Compare it.
Yeah.
Showing.
For us to actually come here to look at some of the documents in the archives relating to the same period and to get to see the plantations, more than anything else, it allows us to place the work that we're doing in New York into a very global context. What we're doing is we're looking at primary source documents, the 17th century deeds of the island, and in particular what we're doing is trying to find deeds that relate to the two plantations that the Sylvesters own, in this case Constant Plantation and Carmichael Plantation, and they would in many cases provide a map right in the book of the plantation itself. And so what we're doing is we're hoping that we can actually find that kind of a description. One of the documents that I'm here to look at is a deed that conveys Constant Plantation in 1654, and it's 67 acres. He sells it for 40,000 pounds of Muscovado sugar, and this is the beginning of Constant Plantation. This is the driving force. This is the engine that's driving everything that's happening at Sylvester Manor. So it actually allows us to understand in a lot, well, in a broader context, why Sylvester Manor itself and the archaeology is so significant, because it's linked to this global economic system that's emerging and maturing in the 17th century. Throughout these deeds, Whenever land was transferred, they would supply a narrative description of the plantation itself, but provide lists of all of the African slaves by name, by gender.
Slavery existed in the Americas before the Europeans came. It existed in Asia, it existed in Africa, and it existed in Europe.
Until the 1640s, most of the really hard agricultural work was done by servants, indentured servants. The indentured servants who came to Barbados came in several waves. Initially, they simply came as servants who might have been picked up on the docks, and felons of all kinds were shipped out to Barbados as indentured servants. And the old policy was that the servant who came out to Barbados would be paid a very lowly fee. He would be housed very badly, and the agreement was that he gave his labor for 7 years, and at the end of that time, he was supposed to be given a piece of land. Now, when sugar cultivation got underway, it was obvious that this needed to be much more intensive and could not be done by a handful of indentured servants in small farms. So people started to accumulate land, and they started to import slaves.
The biggest thing that drove it was because Africans lived in a tropical environment. They somehow could perform better, were less susceptible to all the diseases such as malaria and yellow fever and a number of the infectious diseases that Europeans were succumbing to.
There was an epidemic of yellow fever. They didn't at the time know that it came from Africa with the mosquito, but they did know that slaves resisted it. The planters realized here was a source of ready labor which would survive the diseases, and the medical historians believe that this is one of the major factors leading to the development of slavery.
Sugar gave a perfect opportunity to combine coerced labor, capital investment, and technological know-how in the growing of this plantation commodity.
You can make a fortune out of sugar in the West Indies. All you need is labor, and there's not enough free labor to go around, so it's got to be slave labor. The black population of the West Indies just goes through the roof by the 1660s and 1670s.
Everybody is making ships for the Atlantic slave trade. The Spaniards produced large numbers of ships, the Dutch, the English, the French.
The Dutch do play a major role in supplying slaves to Spanish islands and to Spanish colonies, but in English colonies, the English Royal African Company supplied most slaves to English markets.
The Atlantic trade, known as the peculiar trade by some, was the triangular trade that was slavery. In England, a group of people would get together and say, let's go into business. So we each put in X number of dollars. We can either buy a ship or we can charter a vessel. We get trade goods. That trade goods then comes on the ship and is taken to West Africa. It's leg one. And in that leg, we take that trade goods and we trade that with sometimes local chieftains who have captured people in war. We have people who have established outposts to be collectors of slaves, the wholesalers, as it were. You would then purchase your people from. Then the next passage was from West Africa to the Americas. Initially, a lot of it happened into the Caribbean because that was the first area to be really developed as an agricultural state. South America, Brazil, the Caribbean, the east coast of the United States. They would be brought as far north as here in Long Island Sound. The transfer was now made for bodies for existing commodities that had been produced by the previous groups that had come. Rum, sugar, molasses, indigo, cotton. These were then purchased with the money that was received for the captives that you had sold. That goods was then sold in England, reaping benefits for those people who had put together this whole project. The captives or slaves themselves were not so much the commodity. The results of their labor was the development of those commodities which sold. Let's take it back to what it must have been like in the 17th century. In many cases, if they were going to go for a sale, let's say in South Carolina, big rice growing country, you'd go down where the Mendes are. That's their specialty. You would get people from the interior and the low countries to work port to port until they get what they're looking for. And they started after a while looking for specifics.
There was an internal slave trade within Africa that the Europeans could feed into. It is essentially a trade that is run and controlled from the interior of Africa to the coast by Africans themselves, and the Europeans then have to negotiate with the slaves, and you then get a very complex international trade developing.
You may have had to walk 100 miles or more over a period of weeks, maybe a month, to get from the interior to the coast. There you were put in a barracoon, a large encampment where you were pinned in like cattle and you were sold. Now comes the arduous part of the journey. You're placed on a ship. One of two ways would be how you travel, either tight pack or loose pack. Now tight pack would have been lying on your side, back to front, spoon style, in the hold of a ship. If you were fortunate, relatively, to be in a loose pack, you would lie on your back, shoulder to shoulder, with the person next to you. In any case, you would be chained and attached to them. You would not have any room for movement. Everything that happened to you would happen to you right in that spot. All bodily functions, if you were become seasick or ill. Periodically, on many of the cases, they would bring a portion of the captives up on the deck, throw water on them, and someone would go down and muck out the area. The conditions down below were very oppressive. In some cases, there are accounts of the medical officer going down below to check for who was alive and who was dead, not being able to keep a candle burning because there was not enough oxygen in the air. The trip had to be horrible because not having the kind of weather information we have today, the crossing itself could have been mild and placid, or it could be tormented with storms. The survival rate varied from little as 10% mortality to 40%. Death from disease, death from violence on board. Some of it came from suicide. One other aspect of it that people kind of leave out, being in the slave trade was a dangerous thing for a seaman. Many of them were lost to insurrections. It was a dangerous and despicable situation for all who participated in it. Now you've got to sell them in order to be saleable. They have to look healthy. They have to look strong. They have to look manageable. They would oil their bodies, particularly the men, because they wanted their muscles to show, they wanted to look healthy. Although they may have been sick, they may have had malaria or cholera or whatever. And then they would be offloaded and taken to a barracoon, a place where they would be sold.
It took about 5 years to complete an Atlantic slave trade, in the sense that you went from Europe to Africa. It took you a month and a half. You spent 6 months on the coast. You then crossed in a month and a half from Africa to the New World. You then took some time, maybe a month, to sell all the slaves off, and then the ship would immediately return.
They had a lifespan. They had a productivity range. A commodity has a value because it has a specific usage. The usage of those who labored varied from grunt labor to artisans and craftsmen. And so it was not just the raw commodity of how much cotton you can pick. What can you produce that has value?
Slavery on a sugar plantation was about as bad as slavery got. We know that because the rates of mortality on sugar estates are higher than on estates of any other activity that slaves did. On some sugar plantations, the ratio was sometimes 3 men to every woman. And the result was that there weren't enough women brought to reproduce the next generation, especially given the high infant mortality that slaves suffered. In the Caribbean, there's always more deaths in a year than births. And that means that there's a need for constant importation from Africa. It was cheaper from the planter's point of view to work your slaves as hard as possible and then go out and buy a new one than it was to try to raise children to the age of 14 when they would become productive workers. So in the brutal calculation that planters made, there was very little incentive to preserve the health and welfare of the slave force.
Sugarcane begins to achieve its height, and it's that point that the cutting cycle begins. And it's done by gangs. The first gang was in all probability all males, those at the height of their physical ability, and they would harvest off the oldest cane. The second gang was males that were a bit older, past their prime, and youth that were a bit younger. It also could include women. The third gang would cut a field that didn't require such an expenditure of labor to cut, and thus children could be used for this. Younger women, pregnant women. Each gang had a foreman. The foreman was an enslaved African, one member of the gang, who was responsible for assuring that a given field was cleared in a given amount of time. These were incredibly dangerous occupations. Now, several accidents occurred amongst cutters. The most frequent type of accident that occurred was a cutting or severing of shin bones. The second type of accident that occurred was when people would hold the cane and either cut some of their fingers or cut their hands off. These people are cutting 12, 14, 18 hours a day. Those were fatalities that affected cane cutters. Fatalities that affected those who worked in the mills were no less, but were of a different sort. It was not unusual for people to get their arms or their legs caught in the millstones, or their fingers would get crushed as well. Now, there were accidents that occurred to those who worked in the hothouses, and there were several types of skilled labor involved. There were tenders. Tenders had to ensure that the fire never diminished, that that cane juice boiled continually. Two types of accidents. Burns from the fuel being used, which was frequently cane trash, which flared. Sugar can be very volatile. Granular sugar can explode. It was not uncommon for the sugar trash to flash. The second accident that occurred in these hothouses, they are rendering a juice into a syrup. As that syrup boiled, it was not uncommon for it to splatter like hot oil. As the day progressed and they grew tired, the fatalities, the accidents increased.
You can understand why slaves suffered high mortality in this kind of labor. The harvest was taking place in the middle of the summer. So you're talking about very hot, humid conditions in back-breaking labor going for 9 months of the year, 20 hours a day.
You're being taken from everything you know, and now you're placed in a foreign element. You're deprived of those things which you find as daily routine, those things you find as comfort, those things that you really understand. You're forced to perform labor beyond your normal capacity. Your long day extends into day after day after day after day with no benefit of the product of your labor. No compensation for that, both materially or psychologically. And you're expected to do that until you die.
Tom. Steve, good afternoon. Come right in. Welcome to Dryger's Plantation.
Thank you.
Come inside. You'll like this little bowl. This is made in an English technology. It's wheel thrown and kill fired. But I'd like you to look very closely at the configuration and notice that it has an incurved rim.
Yeah, right.
And it has these two little lines of decoration around. Both of those traits are very, very distinctly West African.
Ah.
This is the next step down the line after true, pure colonial wear.
Okay.
This is made in the learned English technology, but the vessel itself is West African in design and inspiration. And I think that that bowl probably sat upon a table and was intended for holding one of the savory sauces or something for the...
Now, what do you think this dates to?
Oh, it's very distinctly 17th
Oh, okay.
century.
Okay, very clear.
Yes, indeed.
And where did this come from?
All this stuff is from Codrington College.
Ah, okay.
And Codrington was a big sugar estate, and it turned into a college yard in 1710, with the consequence that the area around the house and the sugar factory was not plowed, unlike 99% of the rest of the island. So we are able to find this wonderful stuff intact.
It's taking the English technology, but the style and even the aesthetic of it is West African.
The plantations here on the East Coast, which have access to clay, augmented their income by producing this ceramic.
Okay.
They then imported a large number of African enslaved people who were taught by English potters how to do this. If you go to West Africa, you will discover immediately that ceramics is the realm of women, and viciously so. Men are forbidden to be involved in it. Yet here, these poor West African men were picked up, told, you're going to learn women's work.
Oh.
And I have a feeling that it's one reason that they had so much trouble keeping the potteries going. We scattered.
on locations that have been plowed away to bedrock. The plowing doesn't destroy the artifacts, it simply moves them basically vertically, so we're able to tell a great deal about where things were, but mostly it's a matter of dating.
I can look out on this field, it's just littered with material. Here's a nice big piece of redware, maybe a roof tile. Here's a nice brick, nice yellow brick fragment, and I gotta say that brick looks remarkably like the ones that we get. I might take that one.
To know more about the Constant Sylvester plantation in Barbados, the UMass team is looking for the enslaved workers' housing. Full-scale excavations are planned for next year.
As the demand for sugar increased and planters devoted more acreage to the cultivation and production of sugar, what we call monocropping also eliminated or reduced the acreage devoted to the production of provisions.
To run a sugar plantation, you had to devote the best land to the sugar. But of course, since each sugar plantation might have 50, 100, up to 300 people living on it, you also had to supply them with food. You also needed animal power for traction or for carrying goods to the mill and from the mill. And so each plantation involved a variety of activities. In a place like Barbados, where the island is small and as much land as possible was devoted to sugar, the answer to the provisioning question is external supply. A considerable trade was established between Barbados and northeastern United States, trading rum from Barbados for provisions from the colonies.
The adventure at Sylvester Manor is simply a smaller manifestation of the same idea. The money generated by sugar was sent overseas to establish places that would then be used to supply the wants of the local area.
Needing provisions for the Barbados plantations, Nathaniel Sylvester went north, probably through connections with in-law Governor William Connington of Rhode Island, to find land to grow provisions. Islands were strategic for raising animals, as no fences had to be built to contain them. Fisher's Island was already a plantation for John Winthrop Jr., and Gardiner's Island was a plantation for Lion Gardiner. Shelter Island was not inhabited by Europeans, so Nathaniel bought it from Stephen Goodyear of Connecticut and the Manhasset native people. The colonists were drawn to eastern Long Island by the wealth of natural resources.
About 18,000 years ago, to about 16,000 years ago, we believe that Long Island's North Fork was a tundra. That is to say that only woody shrubs were growing and there were no trees at all. There was permanently frozen soil to a depth of maybe 600 to 800 feet below the surface. So it was a very harsh environment. The ice itself, perhaps a mile in thickness, had receded by 16,000 years ago into the mid-Long Island Sound position or even farther north onto the mainland. The response on Long Island was a change in vegetation. As the climate ameliorated, as it warmed, the tundra became a taiga. And then it went into a conifer forest at around 12,000 years ago, a pine forest. Probably that remnant today we refer to as the Pine Barrens. Oaks, such as this large white oak behind me, didn't get here until around 7,500 years ago and continued without too much change until encountered by humans. When the early European explorers and exploiters arrived on the scene, they saw the resources of these oaks, such as the one that I'm leaning against, as being of particular interest because much of England and Scotland had been mined out, and that extensive forest was a resource, no doubt, that was very appealing. You would get a 2-foot diameter plank out of a tree such as this, and that would have commercial value. To them, it was as good as gold, and when they encountered that forest, they wanted to harvest it, and they set about doing so in a very systematic way.
Back home in England, there are still trees about, but they're not so common as they used to be. And you can't always get the sort that you want, good straight ones. The only thing that you would care of if you heard oak was where it grew. If it was a hedgerow or if it was out in a forest or a coppice. for that would tell you how straight she'd like to be. But here in this country, the whiteout now of the oak that is here, she has the girl virtue, for she's more like English oak. And so the white oak is the stuff that we'll commonly set by for when we need to make outstays for a cooper, or if we're going to be building a boat, we'll save her for that. Sometimes you want to use her in parts of a house where she's going to be on the ground. If I'm building a fence, I want the post to be made out of white oak, for she'll last longer in the ground than the red oak seems to do. The red oak seems to rot a bit quicker. The winter's the best time to take your timber, for the sap be down, and she'll last longer. And so you've got fellers, they'll be needed in the growing season. But then once that work is done, then you come into the autumn and winter time. There's not so much other work needs to be done, and it's a good time for the trees to come down. The most of it we use is to burn. So our fellers will cut a tree down just to get the top off, so they can cut it up for fuel for their fire. Over time, men started building mills here. If you had water running, and you could run a wheel with it, they could run saws, gangs of saws, to saw the stuff out for a cooper for his work. He wants good straight stuff for making casks and buckets and them sorts of things. We'll use them for the frames of ships, and we'll use them for framing our housing with. We'll use them for cleaving out for making clapboards for the sides of our housing. We'll use them for our furnishings. They'll use it for near anything.
This house was built in 1734 by Nathaniel's great-grandson, Brindley Sylvester. Steve and the University of Massachusetts team have been searching for the original 1652 plantation buildings.
In 1652, the four members of the people who purchased this, Nathaniel Sylvester, his brother Constant, who ran 2 plantations on Barbados, Thomas Middleton and Thomas Rouse, signed articles of agreement. And in those articles of agreement, they decided that a structure should be built that would be no more than 6 or 7 rooms. That's a fairly substantial structure in the middle of the 17th century. These were urban people. They were people that were used to living in a city. And if that's the case, it may have influenced the way they constructed their space here. It may have been much more closely coordinated. It might be more urban in character. And certainly that would explain and fit with the intense sort of occupation that we see in the archaeological record. This structure that is described in these 1652 Articles of Agreement speaks to me of a corporate building. A building that any of the four could have expected to visit and have a room in. There's also clear understanding in this agreement, or at least the way it's conveyed, that a very reasonable but measured amount of their resources is to go into the maintenance of the household. While the member of the four partners, Nathaniel Sylvester, was to live here, he was not to take advantage of the largesse of the rest of the three and build himself a palatial estate. I think it was a working building.
When you first come here, there's so much work to be done. You've got to clear ground, you've got to plant crops, you've got to seek for a profit, you've got to raise some money somehow or other to make it worth the while to come over here. You want to build a house that's going to last for a few years, but you're not going to build the sort of house that you might have seen back home, the better sort of living. It's going to be something that's strong, but simple made. And by setting the post right in the ground, it makes the work easier and it'll stand for a reasonable time. A fella might build himself one of these houses with a post set in the ground, and he might have that house for, might depend on that house for 10 years or so, and then he might either have to build another one or he might have to build a better one with sills and stone laid on the ground, and they will be always setting their posts in the ground. Not to say you're not going to find fellas still building that way. If they want a shed or a barn or something like that, they might build it that way. But once a feller's finished getting himself established, he's going to want to build something. If he can, what's a bit better than just having the post on the ground.
The southeast lawn area has been thought by the family to be the original house site.
We wanted to try to put that to rest, whether or not the early house was here. And so what we decided to do was a sort of standard technique, but a little bit more intensive. These wonderful pink flags that you see represent the corners of more than 50 by 50 centimeter test units. And we were able to isolate a concentration of material. There are 3 large post holes directly here that are very significant discoveries that we made. This large one in front of me represents the center post or a corner post for a fairly large structure that was constructed when this feature was filled, probably in that 1670 to 1680 range. This structure, which is probably a late 17th century structure, must have stood at least into a decent part of the 18th century.
post or a corner post for a fairly large structure that was constructed when this feature was filled, probably in that 1670 to 1680 range. This structure, which is probably a late 17th century structure, must have stood at least into a decent part of the 18th century. We're lacking the kind of domestic residue around the area to suggest that it's a house, but that's possible, but it may also have been a barn of some kind. And the pit itself, in the 1670s, it became a very convenient disposal point for large amounts of slaughter waste, animals that were being slaughtered to be shipped down to Barbados, maybe representing 10 to 15 complete animals. The lowest part has some of the remains of the animal bone that's left over from the slaughtering, including calf skull fragments and some small horn fragments, and the rest being jaws and mandibles.
Most of the material we've been studying from Sylvester Manor is the remains of domestic animals. One of the ways that we've been doing this is by doing a lot of work to reconstruct the ages of the animals at the time that they were slaughtered. With some of the sheep teeth, we've been looking a lot at the wear of the teeth and making comparisons with modern reference skeletons. A lot of the sheep appear to be somewhere between 1 and 3 years of age, which is essentially kind of the ideal time for raising a sheep to full size and slaughtering it for food. We know from historical documents that wool production was something they were doing. If we're raising sheep, we're going to try and keep a lot of the sheep alive to a relatively old age, as long as they're productive in terms of the wool. We're going to keep males and females both alive for wool production. So in a sense, the historic record gives us the perspective of the importance of wool production as a product from the sheep, and the teeth and the ages of the animals gives us a slightly different perspective that shows that they were also clearly slaughtering some animals very much at the prime meat age.
They were producing veal because we're finding lots of young, premature cattle.
When we look at the ages of the cattle, we see a bimodal pattern, in a sense, where we have very young animals and adult animals. And this is probably a reflection of dairying, where they would kill off some of the calves and then milk the mother as a way of collecting meat and making dairy products. We really kind of see the complementary nature of the bones and the historic documents. And I think it's a reflection of different types of information from the different sources, and maybe also a reflection of the fact that they could do both of these simultaneously. And one of the things that's interesting is all of the different domestic animals are all very tightly grouped in very clear age ranges, which suggests this clearly was a successful animal raising operation being run by people who really understood the best way to do this.
What I'm working on right now is a 17th century midden. A midden is a trash pile. As you can see it in the sidewall, it's a very thick layer with pebbles and it's artifact rich. And it also shows us the different uses of space in the 17th century.
We'll take soil samples and we put it in a flotation device, put them in a water and air solution that separates out the dirt and it floats out all the organic matter.
The soil samples processed through flotation are dried to later be analyzed for botanical remains.
For the Sylvester Manor project, I only look at pollen, the microbotanicals, and the macrobotanicals, which are pieces of wood, seeds. The way we get the pollen out of the soil is to hit the samples with lots of different kinds of chemicals. Hydrochloric acid, hydrofluoric acid, glacial acetic acid, sulfuric acid, and concentrates the pollen into a smaller volume. I have looked at a column of wood through the midden, and it looks like they may have been using predominantly